To understand this decision, you have to understand the room it was made in. In the spring of 1976, the personal computer did not exist as a consumer product. There was no Microsoft consumer software. There was no IBM PC. There were hobby kits, soldering irons, and a club in Menlo Park called the Homebrew Computer Club where engineers traded schematics like baseball cards. Inside that club were two young men. Steve Jobs, 21 years old, college dropout working at the video game maker Atari. Charismatic, intense, broke. And Steve Wozniak, 25, a brilliant Hewlett-Packard engineer who had just designed something extraordinary in his apartment, a single-board computer that could connect to a television and a keyboard. He called it the Apple I. Wozniak wanted to give the design away for free. Jobs saw a business, but Jobs and Wozniak had a problem. They argued constantly. They needed an adult. They needed a tiebreaker. That adult was Ronald Wayne. Wayne was 41 years old, an industrial engineer at Atari, and Jobs had taken a liking to him. Wayne was older, calmer, and had a workshop in his apartment full of vintage slot machines and engineering manuals. He was the only person in their orbit who had ever started his own company. On April 1, 1976, April Fool's Day of all dates, the three men signed a partnership agreement in Wayne's apartment in Mountain View, California. Wayne typed it himself on his own typewriter. Steve Jobs received 45%. Steve Wozniak received 45%, and Ronald Wayne received 10%. His job was simple. If Jobs and Wozniak deadlocked on a decision, Wayne would cast the deciding vote. He was, in every meaningful sense, the man in charge of the future of Apple. But here is what the headlines about this story always leave out. Wayne did not just sign that paper. He immediately began working. He designed the company's first logo, an intricate pen and ink drawing of Isaac Newton sitting under an apple tree, a single apple about to fall on his head, with a Wordsworth quote running around the border. He wrote the entire user manual for the Apple I by hand in technical English. He drafted the partnership contract clause by clause. He was not a passenger. He was an architect. And then 12 days later, he quit. What happened in those 12 days is the turning point of this entire story, and it has almost nothing to do with computers. The deal that broke Ronald Wayne came from a place called the Byte Shop. The Byte Shop was one of the very first personal computer retailers in the world, located on El Camino Real in Mountain View, California. Its owner was a man named Paul Terrell, and Steve Jobs had just convinced him to place the largest order anyone in their little world had ever heard of 50 fully assembled Apple I computers at $500 apiece. A $25,000 order. To Jobs, this was the moment, the proof, the launch. To Ronald Wayne, this was a death sentence, because Wayne understood something Jobs and Wozniak did not yet understand. To fulfill that order, Apple would have to buy parts on credit. Thousands of dollars of parts, resistors, chips, capacitors, circuit boards. And under the partnership agreement Wayne himself had just typed, under California partnership law, if the company defaulted on those debts, the creditors could come after the personal assets of every partner, not the corporation's assets. There was no corporation. Apple was a partnership. Now this is where the math turns brutal. Steve Jobs at 21 years old had no money. He was living with his parents in Los Altos. Steve Wozniak at 25 had a job at Hewlett-Packard, but no real savings, no house, no significant assets. Ronald Wayne had assets. He owned a home. He had a car. He had a savings account. He had recently lost everything in a failed slot machine venture in Las Vegas a few years earlier and had spent years digging himself out of personal debt. Had crawled back from financial ruin once. He was not going to do it again. He looked at the deal with the Byte Shop and he ran the numbers in his head. If Wozniak missed a deadline, if a shipment of chips arrived defective, if Terrell refused the order on a technicality, if any of 1,000 things went wrong, Ronald Wayne would be the only partner the creditors could realistically pursue. He would later put it in his own words like this. The two Steves, he said, were running on enthusiasm. He had been around enthusiasm before. He had been burned by enthusiasm before. He said, and these are close to his exact words, that if Apple had failed, he would have been the only one with anything to lose. On April 12, 1976, 12 days after signing the original partnership agreement, Ronald Wayne walked into the Santa Clara County Courthouse. He filed a formal statement of withdrawal. In exchange for surrendering his 10% stake in Apple Computer Company, he was paid $800 in cash. A few months later, when Mike Markula came in as Apple's first major investor, Wayne signed an additional document formally releasing any future claims against the company. For that signature, he was paid an additional $1,500. His total compensation for co-founding Apple, $2,300. If this story is gripping you so far, save this video. You are going to want to come back to this one, because the part that comes next is the part that haunts financial historians. Let's do the math that Ronald Wayne could not have done in April of 1976. On January 3, 1977, less than 9 months after Wayne walked away, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak formally incorporated Apple Computer, Inc. Mike Markula put in $250,000 of seed capital. Wayne's old 10%, which would have been adjusted downward in the incorporation, was history. On December 12, 1980, Apple Computer went public on the NASDAQ. The IPO was the largest public offering since Ford Motor Company in 1956. Within minutes of opening, Steve Jobs was worth $217 million. Steve Wozniak was worth roughly the same. More than 300 Apple employees became instant millionaires. That night, in a small apartment far from California, Ronald Wayne went to bed and did not become a millionaire. But here is the truly cinematic part. The Apple share price did not stop in 1980. It kept climbing. It survived the failed Lisa. It survived the firing of Steve Jobs in 1985. It survived the dark years under John Sculley, Michael Spindler, and Gil Amelio. It survived the moment in 1997 when Apple was 90 days from bankruptcy and Microsoft had to inject $150 million to keep its rival alive. And then came the iMac, the iPod, the iTunes Store. The iPhone in 2007, the iPad in 2010, the App Store, the Apple Watch, the $1 trillion valuation in 2018, the $2 trillion valuation in 2020, the $3 trillion valuation in 2022. By the time Apple crossed $3 trillion in market capitalization, 10% of the company, Ronald Wayne's original stake, untouched and never diluted by him through subsequent funding rounds, would have been worth, on paper, more than $300 billion. $300 billion for typing a contract, drawing a logo, and writing a manual, for 12 days of work. But Wayne never owned that 10% in 2022. He sold it for $800 in 1976. Now here is the second cut. The original partnership contract, the document Wayne himself typed in his Mountain View apartment, with his own signature and the signatures of Jobs and Wozniak. Wayne kept it for years in a drawer. In 1994, struggling financially, he sold that piece of paper to an autograph dealer for $500. In December of 2011, that same contract was auctioned at Sotheby's in New York. The sale price, $1,594,000, almost $1.6 million for the contract he had originally been a 10% owner inside of. He had managed to sell the same decision twice for almost nothing both times. This is the part of the story that everyone gets wrong. The cliché version of Ronald Wayne's life is that he is a broken man, a cautionary tale. The unluckiest businessman in history sitting in a dark room, weeping over what could have been. The reality is something else entirely. Today, Ronald Wayne is in his late 80s. He lives in a small mobile home in Pahrump, Nevada, a desert town about an hour outside of Las Vegas. He survives on a modest social security check. He sells stamps and rare coins to collectors. He has written a book about his life. He has given interviews from his living room to the BBC, to Bloomberg, to CNBC. He has been asked the same question in dozens of different ways for nearly 50 years. Do you regret it? And his answer every single time is no. His reasoning is brutal in its honesty. He says that if he had kept his 10%, he would not have been a passive shareholder watching the stock go up. He would have been a 41-year-old engineer dragged into the politics, the lawsuits, the boardroom battles, the firings, the pressure cooker that broke marriages and burned out executives across Silicon Valley for 40 years. He says he watched what success did to Steve Jobs. He watched it from a distance. And he believes the decision he made in 1976 gave him something Jobs never had, a quiet life. He says, and this is a direct quote from him, that he made the best decision with the information available to him at the time. He says he does not believe in looking backward. And here is the part of the story I promised you at the start. Decades after the courthouse signing, Steve Jobs reportedly tried to reach out to Wayne. There are differing accounts of whether the two men ever spoke again in person. What is documented is that Apple, the corporation, never offered Wayne a single share, a single dollar, a single token of recognition. He was, in legal terms, paid in full. When journalists have asked him whether Apple should have done something for him out of decency, out of legacy, out of public relations, Wayne has refused to ask. He has said plainly that he signed a contract. The contract was honored, and he is not in the business of begging. That is the twist. Not that he lost $300 billion. Plenty of people have missed plenty of fortunes. The twist is that he is, by every available measure, at peace with it. The man the financial world calls the unluckiest founder in history does not consider himself unlucky at all. Drop in the comments, would you have walked into that courthouse on April 12, 1976? Or would you have gambled everything you owned on 2 kids and a circuit board? CTA 1213 Min. If you are still here, you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for, the kind that wants the full story behind the headlines, the human decision behind the dollar figure. Subscribe and hit the bell icon. A new money story every week. Corporate collapses, frauds that fooled Wall Street, the deals nobody talks about, empires that disappeared overnight. Hit that subscribe button, hit the bell, and I will see you in the next one. Outro 1315 Min. The lesson of Ronald Wayne is not what most people think it is. It is not always hold your stock. It is not believe in the dream. Wozniak and Jobs got lucky in ways that statistically almost never happen. For every Apple, there are 10,000 startups that vanished in 18 months and took their founders' homes with them. The real lesson is colder and more useful. Ronald Wayne made a rational decision based on the information he had, the assets he owned, and the personal history he had lived through. He had been burned before. He was older. He had more to lose than the 2 Steves. He acted on his own risk tolerance, not someone else's vision, and he has spent 50 years refusing to call that a mistake. There is something almost philosophical in his calm. The world looks at him and sees $300 billion walked out the door. He looks at himself and sees a man who made one decision, slept fine that night, and slept fine every night after. History remembers founders by their fortunes. It almost never remembers them by their peace. If this story hit you, my next video is going to stun you. It is the story of the Nigerian-born trader who lost the French bank Société Générale almost $7 billion in a single week of 2008, a loss bigger than the bank's annual profit, hidden inside a system designed to be unbreakable. The bank is still alive. The trader walked out of court a free man, and the truth about how he did it is the kind of story that keeps risk officers awake at night. I will see you there. On April 1, 1976, 3 men signed the partnership agreement that founded Apple Computer Company in Mountain View, California. Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and a 41-year-old engineer named Ronald Wayne, who held 10% of the company. 12 days later, on April 12, 1976, Wayne walked into the Santa Clara County Courthouse and sold his entire stake for $800. He later received an additional $1,500 to release all future claims. Total compensation, $2,300. If Ronald Wayne had held that 10% through Apple's 1980 IPO, the firing of Jobs in 1985, the near bankruptcy of 1997, the launch of the iPhone in 2007, and the $3 trillion valuation of the 2020s, his stake would today be worth over $300 billion. This is the full story of how the third founder of Apple made the most expensive decision in modern business history, why he says he has no regrets, and why financial historians still debate whether he was a fool or the only sane man in the room. 0000, the $800 deal 01, 30 inside the founding of Apple 04, 00 the 12 days that changed everything 07, 00 what that 10% became 10, 30 the man who has no regrets 13, 00 what this really teaches you.